Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast, we have a repeat offender coming to us all the way back from episode number 27. It's Nick Tiller, PhD. You all will probably remember that podcast as an epic one. It was over 3 hours in length, and it was all about nutrition for ultra running. Nick comes back to us today to discuss how to be a skeptic in this world of sports science. I know that every day when you open up your Instagram feed, you open up your Twitter feed, or you hop on over to Facebook, you're inundated with all these different products, nutrition products, and recovery modalities, things of the like that will purportedly improve your performance. But it's almost impossible to ascertain fact from fiction. Which one of those products work, which one of them don't, which influencers actually use the products that they're peddling, and which one of them are just taking the paycheck. Who knows? It is really difficult to figure out what is going on. And so what I wanted to do on the podcast today is to leave all of you listeners with a toolkit with which you can navigate this world and go through it and say, yeah, this is a reasonable claim. This is not a reasonable claim. And I hope at the end of the day, you can take this toolkit, look for those red flags, and make choices that will ultimately improve your performance. I started out this conversation with Nick with a little bit of banter on how the Koopcast came to be, and I decided to leave it in there just because it was fun. So I hope you all enjoy it. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Nick Tiller. I tell you what, I had to film some video over at my house last night for a certification that I wrote some content for. Mm-hmm. And the guy who we hired to do the filming, I was complaining to him about how horrible I am at figuring out all this audio engineering. And so there we go, right there.
Right? Given what you do.
Well, I mean, I don't know. When I set this podcast up, actually one of my biggest fears was the amount of time that it was going to take, because I'm not trying to monetize it. I'm doing it as a service and for fun, and I get a lot of value out of it personally as well. But I can't let it detract from coaching, which is what I do. And I've been really, kind of really lucky that I've been able to minimize the amount of output that I've put into this by hiring somebody to do the post-production and, bringing on guests to where I don't have to carry the whole conversation and things like that. But, the downside to all of that is I'm still a friggin' kindergartner with a lot of this stuff.
And it's for that reason that I've never started a podcast of my own, because I know how much time it will take, and I'm a perfectionist. I imagine, like you, I want to do it properly as well. I just don't have the time. It's the same reason that I no longer have a blog, because I figured if I'm going to put that much time into writing something, then I should probably be writing something that's going to be published, or that I'm going to make money from. I don't feel like I can justify putting in that amount of time just for the fun of it. Maybe that's my error, but it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and you can do it several different ways, right? Like the time investment that you put into it. It could literally be as easy as one person and a co-host just recording their thoughts on something, and there's value in that, and there's a lot of entertainment value in that. But each level of complexity that you start to introduce, it just gradually chews up more and more time. So if you want to do in-person interviews, okay, you've got to have a setup for that and learn how that works, and take the time to meet people and have a studio or whatever. Then if you want to record remotely, that's a whole different thing. And then if you want to have 4 people versus 2 people, then that's a whole different thing. And then if they're joining, one person's remotely and then one person's, in person, and then you're in the same room, that's another, so it's just just can go on and on and on.
Any additional layer of production
for
quality
sure.
that you add to it.
Yeah.
You know, you start using jingles and
Oh my God.
sound effects and stuff. It gets, can easily escalate.
I was really close to just having a format where it was just me and a co-host, because initially I wanted to just like reduce, I didn't want the time suck of like bringing on guests and things like that. And I got pretty lucky that I got some really good counsel like early on before I went too far down that path. And they said, listen, Koop, like, first off, like, you want to have this podcast where you can simultaneously speak your opinion, but also bring on people that you can challenge and that can challenge you. So
Sure.
you can't do that and like be your own, kind of be in a silo, essentially. And the second thing he said, he's like, listen, you know what you know, but you also know what you don't know. And when you don't know something, you'll figure it out. This is somebody who's known me for a long time. When you don't know when you don't know something, you'll figure it out. But one of the big ways in which you figure it out, not the only way, but one of the big ways in which you figure it out is you reach out to other people that are smarter than you in that area. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Thanks for that advice. I don't know why I didn't think about that earlier. And then the final piece of it, this is what sealed the deal for me. He's like, listen, dude, if it's just you like trying to wax poetic on stuff, you're going to sound like an arrogant prick because you don't know everything. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's totally right. All right, you convinced me. I'll spend a little bit more time like setting this up differently.
But that makes all the difference, and that's what makes the podcast of a good quality, because people will see through that. I mean, and everybody's got a podcast now. The industry is almost saturated. I'm like, come on, are you really qualified enough to be doing this? Do you have the experience to be doing it?
Yeah, that's the shit I would have done when I was 25 years old. Like I knew myself when I was 25. In fact, I'm actually going to bring on the podcast. One of my really early mentors, you might recognize his name, is JT Kearney.
Yeah.
He was really influential when I was like in my mid 20s and I thought I fucking knew everything, and just like kind of constantly like beat me down with this, simultaneous like love and just being really hard and honest at the same time, which is hard to do, right? And I had a lot of respect for him going into the situation, which helps a tremendous amount, because he could be hard on me and I wouldn't take it as he's so mean, blah, he's cussing at me, and how people get nowadays. And I mean, honestly, for like 7 years, it was like, fuck, Koop, all right, this is how we're going to think about this. Like, go back to the well. Here's, I'll give you like this much resource, and you've got to figure out the rest of it. But absent that, I would have totally, like, because I had the personality and the, whatever, confidence or arrogance or whatever, I could bring things to it. And also had like the entrepreneurship. There's a little bit of that goes into it, like you generally want to contribute, but I did not have the insight to realize, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? I did not have the insight to realize what I didn't know. And I would look back on that, and I have pieces of work that you could probably dig up from fucking 20 years ago. But, that stuff lives for forever. And, had I done that, I would have had all this garbage out there that I would have tried to erase from the far corners of the internet.
And you should be recording this, because the Dunning-Kruger, I mean, I write about it in the book. It comes up, Dunning-Kruger, because part of the problem that we have in the health and fitness industry is people overestimating it, or having too much confidence in their own ability, and not being aware enough that they're ignorant of the reach of their own ignorance.
Yep.
And people overestimating their abilities. And that's a big problem with the industry. And the whole notion of expert knowledge is undermined, because everybody's an expert on social media. Everybody's afforded this platform to, disseminate information. But not everyone deserves that platform. Not everyone should be given that platform. Yeah. And this is part of the problem why we have so much misinformation and crappy science because everyone's just disseminating information that they don't really know what to do with. It's part of the problem.
But here's what I want to come away with this podcast with is I want the listeners to have kind of a toolkit, so to speak, or a skill set, I guess is a better way to think about it, so that when those things do come out, they can look at it with a skeptical eye and figure out how to filter through that. Because even me and even our set of coaches that I hammer them all on this all of the time because they're just flooded with information and they're flooded with requests for answers, right? Like, this came out, what do I do about it? What should I think about this? It's hard for them to keep track of it. It's hard for me to keep track of it. It's hard for other kind of professionals to keep track of it. And for a normal person, a normal athlete that's kind of like out there, I trying to put myself in their shoes. It's easy. Here's the example I always give. And this is going to be the start of the podcast. We've already got into it. The best example I can come up with is every April Fool's Day, all of these companies come up with their like own iteration to kind of like fool the public. And it's typically some twist on a current product lineup that they make just believable enough to fool some people. And everybody does it. I remember last year or the year before last, like Solomon did this really funny thing where they came up with a carbon fiber fishing rod and they said that Killian Jornet was going to retire and become a fly fisherman. They had all this footage of him climbing up these mountains with this, fishing rod that Solomon designed. It was really cute. But the best example of this, the best example of how bad our filters are, actually comes from Goo. And they do a good job of these April Fool's Day pranks every single year. One year they had all of these different gel flavors. Like it was almost like the Jelly Belly flavors that are like booger and grass and things like that. They had like pimento loaf and liver and onions, and they redid the packaging to like make it look like it was really, really well done. One year they came out with a new product on April Fool's Day, and it was called Dermacharge. And the concept of the product was a transdermal carbohydrate application. So it was a gel, right? You rub on your skin, and apparently it could deliver carbohydrate. And they went through the whole thing like a normal product launch, and they used all these fancy buzzwords like transdermal carbohydrate application, and they had a fitness model smearing it all over them, and on and on and on and on. And there was this really good blend of humor with like scientific reasoning behind it. And when it came out, I looked at it, I'm like, oh, this is hilarious. Like, this is like really freaking good. But I get in the office that morning and I had maybe, 20 emails from athletes that fell for it. They like legitimately fell for it. They're like, hey, what do you think about this? And so me, I just kind of like laughed that off. I'm like, listen, it's April Fool's Day, you idiots. Like, come on. Do you really think this can happen? But I got an email from, I'm going to anonymize this to protect the innocent. I got an email from a friend of mine who's in the coaching and sports science realm, who should know better. And he sent it to me and said, hey, what do you think about this? And I thought initially that he was just trying to put me on and like get me to like fall for it. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to play along. So I call him up. I was like, hey, yeah, I saw the same thing. Like, what do you think about it? So I'm like playing along with the joke. And we get far enough into the conversation where I realize he's not trying to put me on. He's also fallen for it. And this is somebody who knows better, who's got a master's degree. They does a lot of physiological testing, works with athletes, works with sports scientists and things like that. And finally we get like 20 minutes on the conversation. I'm like, dude, it's April Fool's Day, you fucking idiot. Like, do you really think this? And he felt so bad. He's like, oh my God, I cannot believe I fell for this. Like, I can't believe, like, out of all people, me. And I'm like, I promise your secret is safe with me. I might use it in an example like I just did, but I'm not going to release the day unless you do. But I think suffice it to say, like, even when companies are intentionally putting out like cheeky information and they know that the information is false, like people still don't have a good enough filter to figure out reality from fiction right now. And that's what I kind of want to get out of this conversation is like what can the listener do when all of these things authentically come out, where people are trying to sell products and new things come out, new technology comes out, everybody wants an edge. How do they cut through all of that to figure out what's actually going to work and what's actually just total garbage?
Sure. Yeah, and it's not there's no simple, it's not like there is a simple kind of flow chart that you can follow. It does require kind of this very systematic, methodical approach, but there are absolutely some things you can look out for. There are little red flags that you can try and notice. You can think about the plausibility of the products. You can then start to look at the evidence. And there are options if you don't know how to look at evidence. What I cover in the book is how to read a paper. Something as simple as how to read a journal article. But beyond that, it's like, well, if you don't have the time or the technical capabilities to read a paper, then ask somebody who does. You can defer, right? It's having the humility to ask somebody who knows more than you do. So it's all of these things kind of integrated, and when combined, it gives you the best chance of getting to the truth of the matter.
And there are a few, what I would say, like really good examples of that you point out in your book, where you kind of go through, here's what everybody was claiming and what was purporting, and even things that have been purported or at least twisted within the scientific literature. And here's what's actually going on. I think to set it up a little bit further, like just pick your favorite one. I know it's hard to pick it's like picking your favorite child, right? Because you had these examples there for good reason. I mean, you've got like chocolate is a little bit of alcohol, good for your health, like things like that. But was there one when you were researching this book that stood out to you that it was like, okay, like here's something that everybody can kind of identify with, and here's what happened?
Yeah, probably. I like altitude training.
Yeah,
as a good example because it's quite complex. There's no short answer, right? So I like talking about altitude training because it's very plausible and there's loads of positive research on it. But the reality of the way that it's been exploited and extorted in the industry for monetary gain doesn't in any way match the credibility of the literature. So if altitude training, for example, is going to work, we know that it's more than likely going to be a live high, train low strategy. But there are very complex nuances that most people don't understand. I'm not an altitude specialist, but I know enough to know that not everyone responds to altitude training. It depends on what sport you're training for. If it's an endurance type sport, you're more likely to benefit from altitude training. If you're competing in a more explosive, strength, power, high intensity dependent sport, then altitude training might actually compromise performance because you can't train at the intensities you need to maintain the explosive nature of the sport of performance. And like I said, some people are just non-responders. Some people don't respond to altitude as well as others. But even if you understand all of that, you look at the way the altitude training has been monetized by the industry. You have altitude training centers now that offer you 60-minute bouts, 60-minute kind of training sessions in an altitude training tent or an altitude chamber. And they sell courses of like 6 of these, and you do one a week. Well, even if you are generous and you say that the live high, train low strategies more than likely work, and even if you account for non-responders and everything else, there's absolutely no evidence at all that training for 60 minutes once a week in a low oxygen chamber is going to have any impact on performance. And they don't even talk about performance. They talk about immune function and fat burning, fat oxidation. So we have this core kind of scientific research that is very complex, very complicated, more than likely some altitude training in some capacity is going to be beneficial for performance for a proportion of people. But the way that it's just been extrapolated and exploited by the industry doesn't bear any resemblance to the research that's actually been done. So I like altitude because it's a very complex scenario.
Well, and the origin of that, if you go back and you want to pinpoint like the kind of the very first part of it, is especially on the endurance side of it, is the Kenyan dominance at the endurance events. And all it is observation. It wasn't even, the mechanism kind of followed the observation. They just said, okay, all the Kenyans live and train at 8,000 feet. There must be something magic to this 8,000 feet. And then they looked at the mechanism. Okay, there's some sort of improved, red blood cell function, more, higher hematocrits and things like that. And then the practice kind of followed that. But you could have just have easily have said, okay, all the Kenyans eat potatoes. There must be something magic within the potatoes. Let's start feeding everybody potatoes. But for whatever reason, because it was like altitude and it carried like a little bit of monetization to it, that's what everybody started to chase. And so much so that, I mean, I've seen this on the elite side, and we also see this in the commercial side as well, is that the altitude peak we've already, maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to get out of the prediction business ever since COVID hit because I keep getting it all wrong, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say this anyway. The altitude peak on the commercial side, it seems like we've already hit, and we're kind of coming down from that, where the centers and the units and people using altitude training, especially at a recreational level, it's kind of like it's kind of got worn out by now. And we're just starting to see it almost kind of on the decline, even at the elite side. I mean, you go back to the 90s and the early 2000s where, sports scientists like Ben Levine and that group, they took people to high altitude camps, and it was like the de facto rite of passage that you went to a high altitude camp to train. And it's still prevalent, but it's not de facto.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. It's still very trendy. Most endurance cyclists and endurance runners, in terms of podium-funded programs, will have yearly altitude sojourns. Every year they'll go and they'll do a training camp at altitude. I remember when I worked at the Olympic Center. This is going back quite a few years, and we had a very nice, sophisticated environmental chamber, so we could do temperature extremes and altitude as well. It was it wasn't a hyperbaric chamber. It was a hypoxic chamber. So you couldn't change partial pressure of the oxygen. It was just manipulating the oxygen content of the air. So it simulated high altitude. And I was working with a performance program, and the coaches insisted that we get all the athletes into the environmental chamber to do some altitude training sessions. So twice a week for a 6-week period. And as a relatively young, inexperienced sports scientist at the time, I didn't really have the gravitas, the weight to make any demands on the type of the training, especially when you work with these world-class Olympic coaches who have, won multiple medals, at various Olympic games. But I tried anyway, and I said, look, if we're going to do this, we need to try and do it rigorously so that we know if there's actually any beneficial effect. So what we kind of need to do is get half the team doing the intervention, the altitude training intervention. The other half maintain normal training, and we do some pre and post measures, just a very basic scientific research study, take some bloods and do some exercise testing before and after in both groups, and we just see if it's effective. That way we know, one, if we're wasting our time and money, and two, if it's going to have any negative impact on physiology or performance. And that way, kind of, that will stand us in good stead going forwards. But they didn't like that idea because it took too much time, took too much effort, and it meant that half the group didn't get the altitude intervention. Right. And they were already sold on the intervention. Their minds were made up on this newfangled kind of trendy thing that everyone else was doing. So we went ahead and we did the intervention with the entire group. We did no pre and post testing, so we had no idea if it worked. But the placebo effect, is a powerful effect. So even if it works in the context of placebo alone, that was enough for the athletes and that was enough for the coaches. Whether it actually had any physiological effect, we have no idea.
Well,
But that was almost secondary.
Yeah, and also on the altitude side, the way that most of them are set up, it's set up as a camp. So you go to a high location, you rent out a house, everybody stays there. It's nice, it's away from your family, it's away from all the distractions and things like that. And the athletes leave that camp fitter, absolutely, 100%. But it's hard to tease out, is that due to the altitude or is it like a second order effect from the environment of the camp itself? So the nutritionists that they bring in, the fact that it's an isolated environment, that you've got other training partners around, that that you are kind of, you're less distracted or distraction free or something like that. Like, athletes will always say that they're better after the quote unquote altitude camp. And then that's how that myth kind of gets perpetuated, because they're using the term altitude camp and not just training camp, right? When in reality, what is more likely to be happening is they're benefiting from all of these other second order effects more than the actual altitude.
But a lot of people, and this is the more concerning thing, most people don't actually care.
Yeah.
If it's the altitude that's having the effect, or if it's just the training camp. The placebo effect is a real effect, and for a lot of people, and they've studied this, most people don't care if they get better because of placebo. They don't mind being deceived by their coach into using a placebo, as long as the outcome is improved performance. So I make an argument in the book that actually placebo-mediated treatments might actually have negative outcomes on various facets of society, which we can talk about later if it comes up. But most people aren't really bothered. As long as they feel like they're doing something. If they're throwing money at the problem, if they're going on a training camp, they buy some new running shoes, they buy an expensive heart rate monitor. They've already convinced themselves that it's going to have a positive impact on their performance and their training. And for most people, that's enough.
Well, we're going to go down that rabbit hole, because you perked up my antenna on something that I've kind of like harped on beforehand. So you can throw away the outline I sent you earlier. We'll talk about the placebo effect, because there is a notion out there amongst athletes, amongst coaches, amongst sports scientists, that athletes and coaches should leverage the placebo effect and use these things intentionally, knowing that there's no physiological effect, that they're really just getting some perceived effect from it. And I've always looked at that proposition and said, one, you can only lie to your athletes so many times before it stops working. This is where I put my coach hat on, right? I'm like, you can get away with that like once or twice. Absolutely. 100%. Hey, listen, we're going to do this. You're going to be awesome afterwards. There's this notion that athletes and coaches should use the placebo effect to their advantage. And when I put my coach hat on with that, I always think that you can only lie to your athletes, because that's what you're doing. You can only lie to your athletes so much before the ruse is over. And then the second thing is there's stuff out there that works. So why not use that? Like, if you want to use, a pill or a training intervention or whatever, there's tons of stuff out there that actually work. Why don't use that? And it works, and there's, they think that it works. So you get some sort of like compounding effect from the actual physiological benefit and the psychological benefit from it. Go ahead and do that path, versus just pulling stuff out of thin air and saying, oh yeah, the red pill is gonna increase your oxygen consumption by 5%. So maybe you can like help me understand. I fail to understand the rationale that is prevalent out there. And I've seen a lot of really well-known coaches promote this. I don't understand the rationale for intentionally using a placebo to get a training effect out of an athlete.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because if you look at the research that's been done on the magnitude of the effect from using a placebo, it's somewhere between 1% and 3%. You get an improvement in performance of between 1 and 3. And if you look at a number of well-known supplements, you look at caffeine or carbohydrate during exercise, the magnitude of the effect between 1% and 3%.
Right.
So you can get a similar effect by not using anything, just through the power of the mind. But you hit on an important point. It's like, how do you move this forwards? So I make a really strong case in the book because I'm a little bit old school, a little bit at one end of the spectrum when it comes to good science and being rigorous and evidence-based practice. And I don't like using placebos. People who work in performance do like using them because it does improve performance. That's unequivocal. But in terms of moving that forwards, well, like you say, maybe you've got to use products that work and have been shown in controlled studies to have a positive physiological effect on performance, but also are associated with a strong expectation of effect on behalf of the athlete. So caffeine is a great example because it actually works. There are various mechanisms by which it can improve exercise performance depending on the exercise. But most athletes, if you told them that I'm going to give you a caffeine supplement, they would expect it to work as well. And they've probably got prior experience. Most athletes anyway, if they use caffeine, would have prior experience of feeling, the stimulant effects of the caffeine or having an increase in concentration or whatever. So you get kind of the double whammy of the placebo effect of the expectation, Pavlovian conditioning, but you also have a real physiological effect. But I'm not in favor at all of just using products that only work in the context of placebo because it's a slippery slope. And if you allow somebody to start using products that only work in the context of placebo, then you've got to allow them to use anything that only works in the context of placebo. And that includes complementary and alternative medicines, alternative therapies, chiropractic, homeopathy. And we've got to remember that the world of sports performance is one sphere, but it overlaps heavily with health, which overlaps heavily with the clinical side of things. So taking a sugar pill to improve your 5K run performance, okay, if the pill doesn't work, then it's no big deal, right? You don't break a PR that day. But if you give a sugar pill to somebody with a bacterial infection, then that's a problem, because if you have a bacterial infection, you more than likely need antibiotics in order to get better. And you may not get better unless you take antibiotics. And there are lots of instances, very high profile cases in the media where people have foregone traditional medical treatments in favor of placebos, in favor of treatments that only work in the context of placebo. And people have died, and they're still dying, and children getting very, very sick, and children dying because people are using products that only work through a placebo-mediated effect. And if somebody is critically ill, everyone knows intuitively that somebody's having an asthma attack, probably shouldn't give them a placebo in order to treat the asthma attack.
Right.
But that's kind of what we're dealing with. And if you allow it in one aspect of the health and fitness industry in terms of sports performance, it's kind of a slippery slope to the clinical side of things as well. And that's kind of the argument that I make in the book.
And the real issue for the end users, the athletes that are out there, as I was alluding to earlier in our discussion, was it's hard for them to ascertain the difference. And the typical scenario that gets set up is they open up their Instagram feed. And I'm sorry to pick on the heavy Instagram users. It's just the easiest one. They open up their Instagram feed and they see so-and-so athlete using such and such product. And then they scroll down a little bit further and they see another athlete using a different product. Athlete A could be completely authentic, meaning that athlete uses that product has efficacy, the product helps the athlete. Situation B, the company is paying the athlete's never used the product doesn't work. But those two situations, to many, if not most, end users that are actually looking at it, are indistinguishable. in terms of the way that the person is observing the athlete using those products, and also the effect that it's going to ultimately have on them. And I have people, I mean, honestly, Nick, like on a weekly basis, what about this? What about that? Does this work? Does that work? And it actually kind of becomes like a big part of like my work output, kind of like every week is, you know, filtering through this. And most of them, you know, 95% of them, whatever, I've got pretty stock responses for, because we've seen them time and time again. 5% throw me for a loop and I have to do a little bit of research on. But the rate that people are getting inundated with this stuff, it becomes hard. So maybe we can start to work through, like, I know that it's a skill that needs to be honed, but maybe we can kind of like work through some things that people that are listening to this can go, okay, the next time I see XYZ pop up in, you know, the popular literature or an Instagram feed or whatever, here's some things that I can go through to like provide at least an initial filter for it and not get duped on April Fool's Day by goo again.
I think if it's April Fool's Day, just assume that everything you're reading is trash. That's the first rule. The second rule is that Twitter followers are not credentials. That's the second rule. It doesn't matter how many Twitter followers somebody has or how many likes they have on a Facebook page. That does not make them an authority. You know, this comes back. I have a whole chapter on logical fallacies in sport, and the one that you just described is the argument to authority. You know, paying athletes or famous people to wear a product or to use a product or to be pictured or filmed using a product is as old as time itself, right? So as old as modern civilization. And it's all about the money, right? If you can't distinguish what the athlete's real motives are for using that product, if they're getting paid to endorse a product, then even if they really believe in the product, then the endorsement is tainted. There's going to be an investment bias associated with it. So, for example, I have no doubt that Adidas Predators are a really good football boot, you know, as in soccer.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, you didn't have a pair of soccer boots unless you had Adidas Predators. They were so cool and everyone had them because all of the professional footballers used them. I'm sure they're very, very good boots, but the fact that these athletes got them for free or were paid to be pictured wearing them means that the motive has been confused. And if somebody is selling you something, as in selling you for monetary gain, then the motive has been contaminated by virtue of the fact that they're trying to get your money, right? So it's a little bit pessimistic to assume that everyone's trying to rip you off. But if you start from that base, that everyone wants your money, in the health and fitness industry, everyone's trying to make a quick buck, then you can figure out ways to filter. I like your expression in the email. Or was it filter through the grit to get to the diamonds or something?
Yeah.
But if you start from that base, assuming that everyone's trying to rip you off, and then go from there, that's probably a pretty good place to start.
Not a lot. I'm laughing because not a lot of people want to look at the world through like rose-colored lenses. Like, oh, everybody has the best intentions and things like that. But I mean, I absolutely agree with you that in the health and fitness industry, and it's a whole nother conversation to go down in terms of why this particular industry is like that. And politics is kind of the same way. But you do have to start out with the orientation that this is fake. I got to figure out what's real. That's the way that I look at it. I look at stuff through the lens when I'm evaluating that. And part of me hates to do it because I am actually an optimist at the end of the day, but I've learned and I've gotten duped enough that I have to look at these things through the lens of first it's fake and I got to figure out if it's actually real or not. And it's just like, it's sad that it's like come to that place. How did we end up here?
Well, sure. But if you change the context, right, and think about it in a different industry, you're going to buy a new car and you go to the car lot, right? And you go and speak to the salesman and you say to the salesman, okay, sell me a car. You wouldn't just believe what they told you. they're going to show you, even if they're showing you some used cars, you're going to assume that there's some rhetoric in there. You're not going to assume that they're being honest. You're not going to assume that they have your best interests at heart. You're going to assume that they're trying to make money. And if anybody who's ever bought a car will know this, because unfortunately, used car salesmen don't have a very good reputation. But there's a reason for that. No offense to anybody who might be listening who is a used car salesman. Before you get emails, I'm sure you're the really honest, authentic one. But in most people's experience, they're trying to shift cars, right? Because that's their business. And there's no reason why it would be any different in any other facet of society, especially one like health and fitness, which is confused and conflated with so much fake science and pseudoscience and false claims. It's very easy to make grand claims on very, very weak evidence. You can get away with it. There's not really any regulating authority.
And there's kind of like a sliding scale of this where you'll see in the research side of it, where you'll see research that's intentionally designed to get a particular result.
Yep.
You'll see research that is done kind of unbeknownst to whatever company, and then they latch on to a particular piece of it to exploit it. And then I'm going in a random order here of, degrees of error. And then you see the stuff that has been outright paid for by a company to produce, not only just to produce the research, which that has to happen. Like, research needs to get funded. That's not the worst error in the entire world. But a lot of times they're paid to get a certain result. That's where the error kind of comes. Let's kind of go, what I want to do is now go down like the degrees of error, right? Or the degrees of egregiousness. And I'll start out with my personal example, and then you can get into like when you were actually asked to like personally bias your research. In the kind of the early 2000s, this recovery drink with a 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio started to become extremely prevalent. And kind of the first ones on the market was this company called Endurox. And they were ultimately bought by Pacific Labs, which is a huge nutritional supplement company. And the woman that initially did that research is a friend of mine. She's one of our CTS coaches. She lives up in Denver, Kathy Zawatsky. And I love Kathy to death. And her and I have had many, many, many discussions on how this whole thing transpired. So for those of you out there that think I'm throwing somebody under the bus, I'm not. It's somebody that realizes what has gone on. So when she was a graduate student at the University of Texas at John Ivey's lab, and the listeners, nobody will recognize who John Ivey is, but he is very well respected in the sports science community. When Kathy was an undergraduate in his lab, she designed this study comparing one drink to another. And the first drink was an all carbohydrate drink. And the second drink was the exact same drink, but they added protein in a 4-to-1 ratio. So 4 grams of carbohydrate to 1 gram of protein. The key with that, and the way that I describe that is, or the reason that I describe that way, is that the second drink was the first drink plus keyword, the protein. Mm-hmm. So she comes out with this research. Oh my gosh, this 4-to-1, carbohydrate to protein drink. It had a greater effect on glycogen resynthesis. That was the kind of the summary of the paper. And this company, Endurox, kind of latched onto it and made a beverage around it after the research had kind of come out. And the gist of it is this 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein, ratio was magic. The lab didn't have anything to do with it in advance. The product came out afterwards. It was untainted research and things like that. But what Kathy realized after the fact is that it wasn't the carbohydrate to protein ratio, nor the additional protein. It was just higher in calories that was the primary driver of this glycogen synthesis. But this company, Endurox, kind of latched onto it and ran with it. And they built up a really big business kind of in the early, in the mid, and the late 2000s before other companies started to kind of catch on. And this whole time, Kathy is like, these people are using my research and it's not the way that it was intended, but they could stamp this, it's been validated by research and, blah, 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 blah on it. And we had a relation. This is where the personal side of it came in. So the company that I worked for, we had a relationship with Endurox, an endorsement relationship, where we were pushing this drink. And yes, it was superior to a carbohydrate drink of lesser calories, but the same carbohydrate content. But it wasn't any better than any sort of other drink of the same amount of calories. And it took me about, I don't know, like 18 months to like unravel all of the different steps of this. And it's not a big deal to the athletes at the end of the day. They're still getting a good high quality product. It's not deleterious. It's, WADA approved and all that stuff. But the 4-to-1 claim, which was like the linchpin and all of the advertising, personally, I felt like an idiot for regurgitating that. And I had to go back to a lot of people and say, yeah, we were wrong for this and blah, blah, blah. And that I always point to that example of something that started out benign. Nobody's trying to fool anybody. The company at the end of the day is just trying to make money. They pick the sexiest thing out of the research to promote, and everybody just kind of follows it. And I raised my hand. I was the sheep and I followed it as well. Kind of no harm, no foul. But it's not always like that. Sometimes they go into the situation intentionally trying to dupe people.
Well, I think I would say this is disingenuous. I don't think they're necessarily doing anything wrong, but they're also not being sufficiently candid and transparent, because in that situation, they're not comparing like with like. Well, that's what it comes down to. It's not isocalorific. So you have one product that just contains more calories than the other one. So of course, it's probably going to facilitate recovery better. Plus, it contains protein. And I've seen other examples of that. There's a very, very big nutrition company, which I won't mention, but they advertised several years ago an electrolyte product that, compared to a carbohydrate product, enhanced fat oxidation by about 40%. So you take their electrolyte product, compare it to a carbohydrate product that belonged to their closest competitor, and it enhanced fat oxidation by 40%, which is colossal, right?
Yeah.
So, and that was the claim that went with the product. And it's true, if you look at the studies, they were controlled studies and they were relatively well performed. And the conclusion is valid in that if you compare it against that carbohydrate product, then fat oxidation or lipid oxidation is augmented by 40%. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you're comparing a 0-calorie drink with a carbohydrate formula, right? You're comparing apples and oranges. The carbohydrate formula is designed for one purpose, to replace carbohydrate and to increase carbohydrate oxidation rate. The other one is designed for a completely different purpose. So you're not comparing like with like. So the claim itself is not fallacious, but it's completely disingenuous. And people are going to see that and they're going to think, well, if I use that electrolyte formula, then I'm going to augment my fat oxidation rates, which is something that a lot of endurance athletes might want to target in their training. But if you compare the electrolyte formula to water, the fat oxidation rates are probably going to be very closely comparable. So I think that's a very similar example to the one that you presented. Yeah, technically they're not doing anything wrong, but then they're also being a little bit disingenuous from my perspective.
And so take me through, I want to hear the story personally. I think the listeners will get a kick out of it. You tell it in your book, but maybe you can elaborate it a little bit more in an audio format. When you were going through some of your graduate research or your PhD research?
My master's
research. You had a company approach you to basically fudge the data, like they're going to pay you to fudge the data.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it wasn't data fabrication. That's kind of the worst possible scenario in scientific research, but it was pretty much as good as. So I should predicate it by just setting some of the background. So ideally, what would happen in product development is that there is a rich body of research on a particular area, and then some scientist that's got, had a spark of creativity or innovation would see the literature, this very robust body of evidence on the literature, and then create a product off the back of it. So the research is already in place and the product comes later. And there are examples of that. Is very, very few and far between. They're very, very sparse in sports science. But some products are based on this pre-existing body of literature. But what happens in most cases is that the product is developed and either nobody bothers to do any research on it anyway because they don't need to, because they can pay athletes to endorse their products, or they've got other sophisticated marketing programs, so they don't need the scientific research. Or they then retroactively perform some scientific, quote unquote, scientific research to fill the gap, to fill the void in the literature. And that, more often than not, that's what happens. And that's, it's not the best way to do science, but it's probably better than nothing. So in this instance, I was working during my master's so my master's was actually funded. It was industry sponsored by a sports nutrition company. My master's was based around carbohydrate supplementation, but more specifically carbohydrate metabolism during endurance sport. So I was interested in different rates of carbohydrate oxidation and fat oxidation during exercise in athletes of different abilities, and how we could manipulate that with carbohydrate supplements. Now, at the time, this was back in 2005, 2006, the whole industry of carbohydrate supplements was still quite novel at the time. I think it's fairly well established now. The carbohydrate supplements are beneficial for long-term endurance type sports, for marathons and triathlons and so forth. But at the time, this was relatively novel research. And I was testing different carbohydrate formulas in my master's. And this company approached me because they'd seen the work that I'd done, and they were retroactively doing some research so that they could cite that research alongside this new product that they developed. And it was a carbohydrate caffeine formula. And they knew what they were doing, right? They'd hired this professional cyclist, a big name in the industry, to do 2 time trials. One time trial was going to be, I think it was a 40K time trial in the lab using their carbohydrate caffeine supplement. And the other one was a similar product from their closest competitor. And they asked me to test these 2 products. And in the first trial, they wanted me to test the product from their closest competitor. And in fact, no, I tell a lie. It was actually testing it against a placebo, so it wasn't even a fair trial. That was another instance where we were testing 2 products like for like. This was actually their product against a 0 calorie, 0 caffeine placebo. So we weren't even comparing like with like. So that's the first red flag. But they asked me in the first trial, when the athlete is doing the trial, it's 40K effort, just let him get on with it. Yeah, just tell him that he's using some placebo products, whatever. Let him get on with it. Don't give him any encouragement. And if you can, just have him facing a wall or something. In the second trial, when you're going to use the carbohydrate caffeine product, really try and sell it to him. Tell him that he's using this cutting edge product. Tell him that his performance is going to be enhanced. Tell him that we've done preliminary trials and performance effects have been like 10% or something. And really, give him as much encouragement as you can. And I was kind of thinking back now, I was at a bit of a crossroads in my career because I was relatively inexperienced as a physiologist. I was young. I was broke as well because I was a student. And I was really tempted to take this on, and they were going to pay me a lot of money to do this. But I had the foresight to know that it's not even bad science. This is pseudoscience. Because not only are we not pairing like with like, but it's not a fair trial. And they're conducting the trial just so that they can say in legal documents that they've done a trial with this physiologist at this university. And for a lot of companies, that's enough.
Yeah.
That's enough. That's enough on which they can base a whole line of products. I'm glad to say that I didn't take them up on the offer, and I sidestepped that one. They went to a colleague of mine who did take it on. Him and the company ended up in some legal problems because of the claims that they made around the product.
Oh, wow.
So it was a happy ending all around, not for the colleague that took it on. But this is what you're dealing with in this industry, is that when you have science that's being done for the sake of science, so that companies can say that they've made the effort, this token effort, it's crappy science and it's crappy data. It's not worth the paper that it's published on.
Okay, so that's a hilarious story, and I did not realize the extent of it. The most incredible thing about that, Nick, is the scenario. Like, I can get, okay, you're going to compare product A to essentially water, right? Flavored, no calorie water. Like, that happens quite regularly in nutrition trials, and it's hard to figure out, at least for most consumers, it's hard to figure out when their research validated product has that kind of manipulation going into it. But the environmental manipulation, like, okay, have this boring environment on one side and this super exciting environment on the other side. I mean, that's why they double blind most of these trials. So the people conducting the tests themselves, and you've been in threshold and VO2 max tests, like, you want to try to get the most out of the athletes, so you're yelling and screaming at them. You usually have a script, that you have to kind of go by to make sure that it's standardized every time and whatnot. You go to great lengths to standardize the environment. The fact that they're asking you intentionally to go to great lengths to manipulate the environment, that's the most incredible part of it.
In an N of one as well, with a single subject. There's not one thing about that scenario that screamed good science.
Oh, man.
Everything was wrong with it. I remember working with, about the same kind of time, I was involved in a few different trials looking at carbohydrate supplements. And we tested 20 different athletes. They were all very well-trained cyclists. And one of them, for whatever reason, I think there was a glitch in the system, but he ended up performing 40% better in one trial than in another. And it was a complete outlier. It was, artifactual. We all knew that something had gone wrong with a piece of kit. But the next month, the company that we were doing this testing for had a full A4 page advert out in a big triathlon magazine saying perform 40% better than the nearest competitor. So not only had we not done any stats, we hadn't published the data.
Wow.
It was one subject who had done this kind of random anomalous trial that we knew that we knew wasn't technically accurate, and they'd kind of taken this one result and just run with it. And so that's another example of how these data can be manipulated.
So let's kind of go back to the tools, and I'm gonna lead you a little bit, and if we go off the wrong track, you bring me back because you're the expert here. So the first tool is to inherently realize that people are trying to rip you off. I laugh at it because people are going to be like, "Koop, you're such a pessimist," but I don't know. I've kind of gotten to that place as well. Like, view things when you see an athlete endorse a product, when you see that advertisement in the triathlon magazine, in the trail running magazine or whatever, look at it like, okay, what's wrong with this? Not, oh, wow, this is great. Like, look at it. Okay, how, what are they manipulating here? Start from the skeptical side, not from the accepting side. I think that another tool that people can use is to be wary of the sexy ways to improve performance that have been adulterated. And you touched on one right at the very beginning of this, and that's altitude. We've started to see this with the respiration masks, right? The altitude mask, which went through this whole saga, right? So for everybody who's uninformed, who's listening to this, it's uninformed. There's this company out there that produced a mask that you could wear while you were exercising, and the name of it was the altitude mask. And all it did was restrict the amount of oxygen flow that you could intake. And so it was literally making you breathe harder. But what they were claiming, is that it simulated altitude. They were taking this sexy thing, altitude, and they were trying to adulterate it into a cheap product that they could sell to the masses. They actually had to rename that product. The FCC made them rename that. I don't know if that's true in the UK as well, but in the US, the FCC made them rename it to the training mask because it was blatantly false. But I use that as an example, as another thing that people can do to try to cut through some of the clutter and like find the diamonds. If a company is taking something that has a lot of sex appeal to it, and I'll bring out a few examples. Altitude's one, fat burning is another one, and oh God, what was the last one that I was just trying to come up with? I had it off the tip of my tongue. We'll just leave it at those two, altitude and fat burning, and they're using something, some product, some concoction, some piece of equipment to exploit this area. That's when your antennas should go up.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. If they're taking some kind of something that's trendy, something that a lot of people are talking about,
and can work. That's the other thing, is that in some cases, like that word or whatever can actually work.
Yeah, and it's extrapolating it so that the claim that they're making doesn't necessarily. So altitude is a great example. You can look at compression garments as another example. So compression garments, there is some research to suggest that it might have some kind of role in recovery. If you do some kind of very extreme high intensity or long duration exercise that damages the muscles and that can create soreness, and then you're going to be sedentary for a long period of time, maybe you're traveling or you're sleeping, then maybe if you wear some of these full lower body compression tights, it might help to facilitate recovery in some way. The research is a little bit equivocal on that, but okay, let's be generous. But there's a whole range now of compression tights and compression anklets that you can buy. And they always, when you look at the website selling these things, they cite the literature that is relevant only to full lower body or whole body compression garments. And so the research has been done on full lower body tights, and it's not relevant for an ankle length or a knee length sock. They're not the same thing, but the latter will invoke the research for the former. So it's the same thing. They're cashing in on something that's trendy that may have been shown to work. But if we can, take it a step back, because before we get to that point, I would say that any product that claims to offer you rapid results, that should be a red flag.
There you go.
Because, I'm not a coach. I'm a scientist, but you as the coach, you know better than anyone, and I'm sure most of the athletes listening to this will know that anything that is worthwhile in health and fitness and performance has to be labored after. You have to toil after it. It doesn't come in a week or 2 weeks. It's something that you have to invest in. It takes time and discipline and determination to slowly develop fitness, to increase your strength, to reduce your body fat, to improve your fitness. These things take time, okay? And anytime somebody tries to sell you a product, whether it's a supplement or a diet or a compression garment or a pair of running shoes that claim to offer you very quick, rapid, simple results, that to me is a red flag, because most of the valuable things in exercise and performance don't come rapidly. They have to be earned with time.
They're chronic adaptations, not acute ones. Yeah, 100%. I'm with you there. I've also, one of the things that I also use to like filter through this stuff when there are scientific claims associated with whatever is going on is I'll go and I'll look up the research. And I think you gave a little bit of indication to this earlier, where is it comparing the product to the actual research, or are they extrapolating that to a certain degree? Like in the compression garments, where the research is based on whole body compression, and they're just saying, well, this calf sleeve is pretty close to whole body compression, which is a big leap. I mean, it might not seem like a big leap to, the lay consumer, but in the research world it is. The other thing that's related to that when we're looking at scientific claims, and this goes along both products and supplements and nutritional interventions, is who is the audience that they're researching. And I'll immediately skip to the participants. And if they're normal people, not athletes, almost all of the time, there are very, very rare exceptions to this. Almost all the time, I'll throw that away because, as we know, it's really easy to get an adaptation or a positive response from somebody who doesn't exercise when we're talking about the exercise world. It's easy. They'll adapt to anything because they're coming at such a low level. If you're talking about trained or elite athletes, there's a higher burden of proof, I guess, is what I'm saying, on the intervention side. But a lot of companies will just think that everybody's not going to read that part. And so they have a piece of equipment. They have all these recreational or even people who don't exercise. Sometimes it's even an obese population that uses the pieces of equipment or the intervention and, they improved by 50%, 60%, 100% in some sort of metric. And it seems amazing. And athletes look at that and go, oh my God, if I improve 50% on my 10K time, I'm the world record holder. But what they don't realize is they're looking at an obese population and not an athletic one. So that's the second one I go to is who are the participants in the study that the study is citing?
And a lot of the research, if you look at the stuff on ketogenesis, for example, a lot of the early research was done in rodents.
Right.
And there were people who were already selling diets and making claims based off of rat and mouse literature. It's only kind of more recently that there's been more stuff in humans. But looking at literature is very difficult because not everyone has the time or the capacity to read literature. And it does require a certain understanding of the exercise science. And that can be learned for sure, but there are a number of things you can do before you even start looking at the studies and looking at the research. There's a bunch of things you can do. And I think in chapter 5, I kind of talk at length about these 3 different stages that you can go through to really evaluate if a product is likely to be worth your time and money. The first stage is looking to see if there are red flags. If red flags kind of crop up that make you go kind of something that doesn't quite sit right. And we've mentioned a few of those already. So does the product offer rapid results? That to me is a red flag. Is the product that's being advertised particularly pertinent or trendy? Are they cashing in on something that is just in the media? Is it very current? So that's another kind of red flag. You can also look at whether the product is being marketed on what we call a logical fallacy. And there are kind of between 8 and 10 logical fallacies that are used really commonly in the health and fitness industry, but I'll give you a couple of examples. One we've already mentioned is the product being sold on what we call the appeal to authority. So is a famous athlete or a famous celebrity, I guess celebrities are famous by definition, but is an athlete or a celebrity being paid to be pictured or filmed wearing the product or using the product? More often than not, they are. Okay, but just because your favorite soccer player or your favorite runner or a famous cyclist is pictured using the product, that doesn't necessarily mean that it works. You've got to remember they're being paid to wear it, right? You've got to think about the motive. Lance Armstrong was sponsored by Nike for many, many years, and they very quickly dropped him when they found out, what he'd been up to. But just because an athlete is sponsored by a particular brand, that doesn't mean that the brand itself necessarily has any merit. The product's got to be judged on merit and merit alone. Another example is the appeal to popularity. Just because a particular product sells in a particularly high volume, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the product is efficacious in its own right. So you can look at protein powders. Let's say I develop a protein powder called Tiller's Protein, and I advertise it with the slogan, over 1 million products sold worldwide. Well, just because 1 million products have been sold worldwide doesn't mean that the thing actually works. It just means that 1 million people have bought it, and 1 million people can be wrong. Believe it or not, maybe I've just got a very sophisticated marketing strategy. Maybe I've fudged the sales statistics. So does the product actually work is a different question to how many products have actually been sold. So these are all red flags.
Marketeers I'm gonna let you keep going, but I want to like break in just a little bit. That's an intentional marketing strategy by a lot of companies, is to saturate whatever space that they're playing in, the endurance space, bodybuilding space, whatever, to saturate it with product, like almost literally flood it with product. So it makes it seem as if everybody's using it. They'll get a bunch of capital behind them, go out to their investors and things like that. And an intentional, very deliberate strategy is taking advantage of this logical fallacy, the appeal to popularity, that everybody is using it. And really all they're doing is they're just flooding the market with free stuff. I know coaches who have done that. I know people like in the coaching industry that when they first get started, and I can't kind of blame them for the strategy because you got to start somewhere, but they intentionally just try to get as many people on board as possible at a free or super low price point in order to like seem as if everybody is partaking in in their services. But it's really, I think it's really fascinating that you mentioned that, because I've seen, and I've talked to people in marketing departments. I'm not going to reveal their names. I've talked to people in marketing departments where they've admitted, they're like, this is a strategy we use. We want everybody to think that everybody else is using our product. We want as much of it in the marketplace so that it seems like the next greatest thing that everybody's using.
But there are two things to unpack there. Firstly, you're referring to something called the exposure effect. And I'm going to read directly from the book here. This bias pertains to the visibility of a brand, which in turn results in the inference, that's on behalf of the consumer, that it's a superior product, just by the fact that you see it a lot. And it links in with the appeal to authority, where athletes and celebrities are wearing the products by virtue of the fact that you see the product everywhere. You just assume that it's a high quality product, and you don't take the extra step to test if the product can be valued on merit alone. The other thing to consider is that, again, I don't want to paint too much of a negative picture, but marketing campaigns are designed to exploit our ignorance and our insufficiencies in our cognitive decision-making processes. So we have evolved reason and logic for basically for navigating hypersocial groups, and we have an ingrained economy in our brains. We are hardwired for economy. It's called heuristic problem solving, and this served us very well when we were hunter-gatherers, 10,000 years ago, when economy was very, very important for survival. Our genetics haven't changed a great deal since that time, but modern society, modern culture has. And we haven't been able to adapt with sufficient speed. And there are actually websites that are run by marketing companies that will actually, how can I put this? That they're designed to help companies to design marketing strategies and advertising campaigns specifically to exploit those cognitive biases. There are even websites dedicated to helping companies to single out which specific athletes they should target in order to make the product visible to a particular population. And because this is the way that products are sold nowadays, that they are sold specifically to exploit the cognitive biases and the insufficiencies in our product knowledge, because this is big business. The health and fitness industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So we have to be familiar with the way that it works. And the first step, at least, is being able to identify when some of these red flags are being sprung. And we've covered several of them. And that's the best place to start.
Is this really, Nick, in your opinion, when we're looking at, that's my dog Sasha, she makes an appearance on the podcast every once in a while. Um, is this when we're trying to evaluate? Well, first off, I'm going to ask that question at the end. Why is it the nutrition industry that, at least over the last maybe decade, is like particularly problematic? Like, why is that? I can't put my thumb on it, but it just seems like that industry tends to be more exploitive than the rest of the ones that I have to deal with.
Well, it's two or three things. Number one, nutrition is important to everyone. Whether you want to lose some body fat to get into your swimsuit in the summer, you're going to look to nutrition. If you want to improve your exercise performance, you're going to look to nutrition. If you want to gain muscle mass, you look to nutrition. So nutrition is important for exercisers and athletes alike. That's the first thing. The second thing is that most people are relatively naive to the basic tenets of nutrition. Okay, most people understand the basic tenets of nutrition, but they wouldn't know enough to be able to design a really comprehensive periodized program. The third thing is that it's completely unregulated. Anybody can refer to themselves as a sports or performance nutritionist. You don't need any qualifications. You don't need any advanced degrees. It's different to, if you want to call yourself a dietitian, you have to have a degree in, an associated degree. You have to have a master's, and you have to have completed a minimum number of hours in a clinic as a dietitian. Okay, and it's a protected term in most countries of the Western world. It's a government term. So you can't call yourself a dietitian unless you have the appropriate qualifications. But you can do a weekend course in, healthy eating or performance nutrition, and you can set yourself up as a sports nutritionist. So what you see more often than not is that undergraduate students who have degrees in sports science, they set themselves up as performance nutritionists, and they can get away with it because it's not a regulated term. So the combination of all of those things, that public are relatively naive to it, everyone looks to nutrition, and anybody can call themselves a nutrition guru. That's a recipe for pseudoscience and a recipe for bad advice and misinformation. I should add a caveat. That's not to say that sports nutritionists cannot be excellent nutritionists. Some of the best nutritionists I know have come from a sports science background. Many of them have advanced degrees and are members of, different nutrition governing bodies, and have many, many years of experience and, published lots of research. It comes back to this basic idea that each individual must be judged on merit. But, some of the most famous sports nutritionists in the world have very few credentials, very little experience, but they have a lot of Twitter followers. I'm not going to mention any specific names, but they set themselves up as nutritionists or nutrition experts. They get a following, and they make a living writing books. And as is so common on social media, particularly Twitter, is people that have most of the followers are the ones that probably deserve them the least. The real experts are the ones that have a much harder time getting their message out there.
It's hard, man. I get that question asked of me a lot. Is like, who do I follow on Twitter for the right information? It's hard. Like I have a hard time with it, and I try to keep track of it a lot. And I can imagine somebody without a reasonable background trying to do it as well, that just wants the right information, because they're just as subject to this person has a lot of followers, they must know what they're doing, otherwise all these people wouldn't have followed them. What's crazy is like we're also starting to see some people who have been like, have really outstanding careers, and then for whatever reason start going off the deep end. And
I have no idea who you're talking about.
Well, I don't mind mentioning this, because I do think it's a learning lesson. The one that like comes to mind to me the most, that I think you're laughing about, is Tim Noakes. And I have bought, to set this up. So Tim Noakes is a sports scientist out of South Africa, and when I first started like managing and mentoring coaches, The Lore of Running, which is his like capstone, book that he produced, I've probably bought 60 or 80 of those books to give to new coaches. It's one of 4 or 5 that I bought routinely when we had a new coach come in, or when I knew somebody was getting into coaching. I'd buy him this little gift package, and The Lore of Running was one of them. And everybody had a ton of respect for this person, and he had a huge following and whatever. And then just recently, for whatever reason, I should set this up even further in an effort of full transparency. He was actually on our board of advisors at CTS for a while, and this is very early when the company started, and so he and I would have to have some professional interaction at some level or another. But anyway, over the course of years, for whatever reason, he started taking up all these conspiracy theories, and vaccines cause this, and it just started kind of like going off the deep end with all of this. But because he had amassed this huge, impeccable reputation, people followed him with that as well. People followed him on all of this other salacious stuff that it's just quite frankly bizarre. And it's hard, like if you're relying on somebody for advice, and this is the position I was in, right? I was relying on him for advice. I followed him. I gave his book to, probably 100 coaches, now that I'm thinking about it, over the course of years. When that person that you're relying for on advice all of a sudden is not giving good advice out, that's a hard thing to actually sift through, and that can happen. That can absolutely happen. And I don't know, it's been one of those things that runs in parallel with the Twitter followers. It's hard to like actually cut through when that happens.
Yeah, from a critical thinking perspective, there's a lot to unpack there. There are 3 things I just want to quickly touch upon. Firstly, Tim is an MD, he's a medical doctor. So he's a sports scientist now, but he comes from a medical background. And it's pertinent because he's obviously sort of one of the linchpins of this low carbohydrate movement. And I have no intention of weighing in on that argument or the evidence associated with it.
That's another podcast.
That's not a podcast that I'm ever going to be a part of. But I use this as a great example because it's a really important teaching point for anybody who wants to learn about critical thinking in this industry. Because it's a great example of an ideology or an inherent bias. Because there are 2 sides of this argument: low carbohydrate, high fat, low fat. And there are people on both sides who have already made up their minds, despite the fact that it's a contentious issue, despite the fact that the evidence is inconclusive. A lot of people have already made up their minds. Now, I've always reserved making up my mind on that topic because I haven't read enough of the literature to really be as informed as I'd like. Because my main job is in respiratory and exercise physiology. This isn't my domain. I don't have time to learn about everything. But I know more than most about this topic, and I'm reserving judgment. There are people who have read a lot less than I have, who have already made up their minds and have decided which camp they're going to sit in. By definition, that is an ideological position, and that's an inherent bias. So it's a really important teaching point that if you're not a true expert, you don't really know all of the literature, just reserve judgment. It's okay to say that I don't know. Those 3 words are really important as a scientist, and as anybody who's trying to learn anything about the truth of how the reality really works, it's okay to say I don't know. The second thing is, specifically with Tim, is that nobody is immune to giving bad advice. I'm not saying that he necessarily is or isn't. I don't want any emails, but, I think as an example, medical doctors are put on a pedestal in that if you get advice from a medical doctor, then it's considered to be good advice. But, very often you have medical doctors who are also practicing homeopaths, and homeopathy is a widely discredited alternative therapy that has been shown not to work. It has no plausibility in that it cannot work, and it's been studied and it does not work. And yet you have medical doctors who are prescribing homeopathy to patients. Comes back to the placebo effect. So, not all authorities, in fact, no authority, no individual should just be assumed that to always be right. You've always got to take the advice and test it and question it. Nobody is above scrutiny, and no idea is above scrutiny. The last thing to mention quickly is you mentioned Tim's running book you've given to all of these different people. The book itself is still an excellent book.
Yeah.
And whatever you think about him as an individual, the advice in the book is still sound and it's still robust. And you've almost got to separate the individual from the advice, because you can launch an ad hominem attack on an individual. Oh, so-and-so is an alcoholic, you can't trust him. Or so-and-so is, has gone off the deep end and you can't trust their advice. Well, look at the advice itself. Is the advice rooted in evidence-based practice? Can you judge it on merit to be sound advice? And the book is and always will be an excellent book. So I think you're safe in still disseminating that around.
Well, and that's how I've had to pivot my counsel. So earlier my counsel was, here's this book, go ahead and follow all the other stuff that this sports scientist is doing, to now, here's the book, take the information for what it is. If you're following the rest of it, look at it with a skeptical, through a skeptical lens. It's just a really bizarre example that I've brought up to a number of people recently. And I think it's one that enough of the listeners out there will kind of know some of the background on, that there's kind of like a learning lesson in. I want to come back to a question that I was going to ask earlier, and then I got interrupted with railing on the sports nutrition industry. We'll give them a little bit of kind of a break for now. But I presented this to you in the email as like, as you mentioned, sifting through the dirt to find the diamonds. Is it really a process of elimination that you have to go through? Like, this is bunk, that is bunk, this is terrible. Okay, now we've gotten to the final one. Do we really have to go through this whole rigmarole, this whole circus of a process of elimination to figure out what works? Or is there something that we can just like look through to say, yep, that's it, that's where I can go?
It's probably more the former. I think
There's no hope.
If you look at the range of products that are available, thousands and thousands, I think there are something like, at the last count, I can't remember if it's 5 or 10,000 different supplements.
Oh my gosh.
Alone. I think it's something like 10,000 different supplements and that's just one aspect of a much broader industry, right? And the supplement industry, there's a little bit more regulation in terms of products and practices. There's little to no regulation. So anybody can come up with a new product or a training program or a diet. It doesn't have to be proven. As far as the FDA is concerned, it only needs to be shown to be safe. And actually, there has to be evidence that it's harmful before it be taken off the market. So it doesn't even have to be shown to be safe. It will remain on the market until somebody can prove that it's not safe, which is a completely backwards way of doing things.
I know, right?
As far as so the vast majority of products that are available on the market have no evidence for efficacy and probably don't work. So yes, it is probably a case of just assuming something doesn't work until proven otherwise. That's probably the safe way to approach things, but you don't always have to just, okay, if you see a product that you're interested in and then go through and, okay, see if there are any red flags and then check what the plausibility of the product is and then start looking into the literature. Ideally, that is the process that you would follow. And I go through that in the book. But you can also defer. If you're not sure, just defer to somebody who knows a little bit more than you do. Speak to an expert sports scientist. Speak to somebody who's trained to evaluate literature. Speak to somebody who's been working in the area for an academic, for example, or an expert coach. or somebody with many years of experience as a sports nutritionist who's appropriately credentialed. These are all shortcuts that you can take that are more likely to give you positive results. You don't necessarily have to go through every single product by a process of elimination, try and find, the 2 in 100 that are actually going to benefit performance. You can ask people that have probably done the heavy lifting for you. And, that is a way of doing it. And I talk about a lot of products in this thing, many of which don't work, but some of them do. And I try and provide, very concise literature reviews on many different sports science products so that I've done heavy lifting for you. I've looked at independent studies. I've read the meta-analyses and the systematic reviews. And then I try and provide a nice, concise summary on, okay, these are the positive aspects, these are the negative aspects of the product. And I've tried to do that for some of the more popular products that are available. But there are just so many. It's, there are books and books worth of literature reviews there. But that's the other thing. Look at systematic reviews. You don't just have to look at individual studies. Look at systematic reviews and meta-analysis who have come to the conclusions for you already, and they've done the heavy lifting on your behalf.
Okay, so here's the nickel version of everything. Be a skeptic, especially when we're talking about nutrition products, and I would say to a lesser degree about equipment things. Be a skeptic. It's okay to have that skeptical lens. When we're talking about influencers, there are absolutely people that wholeheartedly, find benefit from the products that they're endorsing, but those products should be evaluated on merit, not because of the endorsement that they receive. There are some gems to find at the end of the tunnel, and you can leverage the experts that have done the heavy lifting for you in order to find those gems. Those are like my top 3. Well, and I guess the fourth one, is look for the red flags, because I think most people can look and say, okay, this is kind of weird. And if it's kind of weird, then you can probably throw it in the trash bin. Those 4 things I think are the summary highlights.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's fair enough. And I would add to that by saying that critical thinking skills, just like any other skill, has to be trained and it has to be honed. You can't just expect to intuitively know, because we all have ingrained cognitive biases, and it takes time and practice and training to learn how to. You never can eliminate bias, but you can mitigate it as much as possible. And you just got to practice and train your critical thinking skills. Read books, read articles, speak to experts, and you will get better at doing it. You won't just learn how to do it overnight. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. You just have to invest the time, because as we said earlier, anything that's worth obtaining is worth investing time over. And that's what you need to do.
Yep. Okay, so I think to leave the listeners, I'm going to do 2 things if you're up for this. First off, in the show notes, I'm going to link to the IOC's consensus statement on supplements, since we just spent like an hour and a half throwing the nutrition industry underneath the bus, because I really like their recent consensus statement that came out, because it's easy for most lay people to read, and it gives you the top, I think there's like 5 or 6 things that actually work. You okay with that? Put that in the show notes? Okay.
Sure.
That's the first thing. And I'm also going to link to your book that we kept referencing. You okay with I plug it instead of you plugging it?
Go ahead.
Well, okay. So
I trust you.
Nick's book, that's a lot, man. We'll see if you trust me after this. So Nick's book is The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, Confronting the Myths of the Health and Fitness Industry. And this is how Nick and I got to know each other, is through this book. And I have bought it through Amazon. I paid my hard-earned money. Nick didn't send me a free copy. His publishers didn't send me a free copy or anything like that. I read it and I personally like it. And it is going to be one of the books that I use for our coaches that come in to give them a little bit more of a critical eye. I have found, and this is compliment to you, Nick, that it blends the practical and the scientific world very well. You come up with real world examples, some of which are recent and some of which are like 100 years ago, which is hilarious, of examples in the sports and the nutrition field where products have been put out there that don't meet the claims that that they say that they're going to, and kind of people have been duped, and sometimes that duping is can result in death, as we mentioned earlier, and sometimes it's just you have the wrong product, and like no harm, no foul, except for the integrity, which is a big thing as well. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. I hope people go check it out. It's a cool book. You have anything else to say about it, Nick?
As far as reviews go, that's a pretty good one. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good book, man. I appreciate it. All right, man. Nick, as always, where can people find you on social? You're also a good Twitter follower as well, or Twitter follow as well. I always appreciate the stuff you put out there. It makes me think.
You can find me on Twitter at NBTiller, and I tweet about ultramarathon and science and exercise physiology and all the stuff that I'm interested in. You can find out more about the specific work that I'm doing on my website, which is nbtiller.com. And that's all I have to say.
You guys just did a real cool study on rock climbers. Is that out yet?
Yeah, we just published 2, actually. One looking at blood pressure responses and one looking at general cardiometabolic responses. We stuck a metabolic cart, like a gas analyzer, on a bunch of elite rock climbers and got them to do some indoor bouldering. And it's the first published study to actually quantify the cardiorespiratory demands of climbing. It's a neat study. You can find a link to that on my website, I believe.
Cool. Go check it out.
We've got just one other thing. We've got a really nice study that is hopefully going to be published soon. It is basically asking the question, are females physiologically predisposed to ultra endurance sport? And we're tackling this age-old question that has been it's been attempted a bunch of times in the mainstream media, never very well, if I'm honest. I decided enough's enough. Let's get some experts together and actually tackle this question. And it's blowing out of all proportion now. The article's getting bigger and bigger, as you'd expect. But watch this space, and there'll be more on that to follow.
Oh, I can't wait till that comes out. That's going to be like so good for eating popcorn and watching people comment on it.
Close the comments section. That's it. Just turn off comments.
I can't wait. There's like 2 things that have like historically like gotten me into a little bit of hot water. One is the whole diet tribes of, the low carb people and the high carb people. And that should go without saying, just because everybody's kind of used to it right now. But the other one is will women eventually outperform men past a certain distance? And yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, again, it comes back to the theme of our discussion, is that a lot of people have already made up their minds on this without knowing anything about the literature.
Yeah.
To reserve judgment.
Yep.
Until you know a little bit more.
I'll reserve judgment. Maybe I can cajole you into the early release of it, but I'll reserve judgment until it comes out then. How's that?
All right, you got it.
All right, man. Appreciate it as always, Nick.
A lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Nick for being on the podcast today. Really appreciate it. In an effort of full disclosure, I bought Nick's book with my own hard-earned money. I thought it was a great investment, a great value, and I will leave the link to his book in the show notes. I encourage you guys to check it out. You can even rent it for a period of time on Amazon. It's a pretty easy read. So go check it out. Really appreciate Nick coming on podcast. Appreciate everybody listening. If you have not had the chance, skip on over to Apple Podcast and give this podcast a rating or a review. Really appreciate reading those ratings and reviews as they come across my desk. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.